at that new quest. So something else you don't know about me is that I met Bennet Wright in prison. I was on a tour of the St. Clair Correctional Facility, and a couple of years later, a tour of the Donaldson Prison, both led by Bennet. And in that tour to Donaldson, we saw the infirmary. We saw a lot. We saw the infirmary, we saw death row. We saw a lot of things that few of us get to see. You may know the Dostoevsky quote, "The degree of a civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." Or you may have read where Mandela said, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails." A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but by its lowest ones. Those tours with Bennet remain among the most disturbing days of my life and challenged me to think about what kind of society we're really building in Alabama. I've been fortunate to have many conversations with Bennet in his role as executive director of the Alabama Sentencing Commission. And each time he challenges me to learn more about the complexities of our corrections system and the reality there is no simple fix and no easy answers and no cheap solutions. Bennet is a native of the Crow Indian Reservation in Montana, and he holds undergraduate degrees in criminology and a graduate degree in sociology, and we're lucky to have him here in Alabama. He's worked for the federal judiciary at the United States Administrative Court in DC, specializing in wiretaps and in bankruptcy. He's taught university courses in statistics, in sociology, in criminology, and deviance. He's former president and vice president of the National Association of Sentencing Commissions and currently chairs the commission's Standards Committee on State Sentencing Guidelines and has chaired the Study Commission on Pre-Trial Services and Alternative Courts. He was a member of the Prison Reform Task Force here in Alabama and has served on various ALI committees, including revising the criminal code and reviewing collateral consequences of incarceration. He's an expert in this work and routinely sought out to advise other state and national leaders. Fundamentally, however, I think Bennet's work is to challenge policymakers and citizens about our understanding and our assumptions about our correction system. It's ours because we pay for it. And for better or worse, it reflects our values as a state. His unique experience and insights challenge all of our ideas, whether we lean to the right, we lean to the left, or we don't really know which way to lean. This is often the case in this conversation. I'm glad to welcome him here and have him challenge us today.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Kiwanis Club of Birmingham, for actually having me. You know, I typically hear people like to see me come, but they love to see me go. This probably isn't the rosiest subject to actually discuss, but it's very important. You know, I guess from the outset, I'm kind of a weird person to be in this position. One, I'm not from here, as Ryan mentioned. I'm from Montana, and I'm also not a lawyer. I think both kind of gave me a unique position to come into the state to kind of survey what the current landscape was and to try to identify what the inherent strengths and weaknesses are. And as Ryan said, my primary goal is to provide information and to advise people of solutions, things that wouldn't be good, and just to do an overall analysis. I think I always like to start with this quote by Judge Colquitt. There are many of you in this room may actually know Judge Colquitt. He was a circuit court judge for about 20 years, and he was a professor of law for over 20 years as well. And I think the biggest mistake people make, particularly in criminal justice, is they want easy answers, and they really fall victim to the KISS principle. And in an area like this, it's not good. And his quote, "It's vital that we do not succumb to oversimplifying a complicated process and accepting easy answers. In this complicated area of law, solutions that sound simple are invariably based upon limited information or faulty assumptions." I don't think you could find a more accurate quote to discuss any criminal justice system, but particularly that of Alabama. So I would like to start with that, just to let everyone know it's very, very complicated. what kind of I want to do is just discuss the road Alabama is traveled, kind of where we're at, and we've really been here before. In the early 1970s, Alabama went into federal court on the same issues that we have currently now in the state. The state of Alabama right now is in federal court on 5 different fronts. We're there for our ability to provide a constitutional level of medical care, a constitutional level of mental health care, our ability to provide safe and humane living conditions, our ability to provide inmates from other inmates' violence, and our ability to protect inmates from sexual assault. That's not what you want to hear if you're in a state, right? You don't want to be in federal court on 5 different fronts, okay? The state of Alabama in 1971 went into federal court before the famous federal judge here in Alabama, Frank Johnson. And one of the reasons why I think people need to be wary of Alabama entering the federal courts and the prison system, that lawsuit that began in 1971 lingered 17 years in the state of Alabama. It took Alabama 17 years before Judge Johnson's successor, Judge Varner, relinquished Alabama's prison system back to the authority of the state rather than under the federal courts and or other jurisdictions. And I also want to just read you a couple quotes from the 1970s and 80s, and I think that these will ring familiar. This is from an article from 1985, but it said, in recent years, the Alabama legislature has sharply increased spending for prisons, including selling bonds to finance new prisons and other improvements. Okay, that's the same thing the state of Alabama just did last year. We sold bonds to finance brand new prisons. I think this is very telling. When Judge Varner, at the hearing, when Judge Varner relinquished control of Alabama's prisons back to the state, he said, quote, even anticipated new and expanded prisons will ultimately be unable to avoid the constitutional violations which will surely follow. That was Judge Varner's final quote in 1988 when he relinquished control of the prisons back to the state. Okay, we're going to come back to that quote in just a minute. Okay, I want to give some history to Alabama's prison population because the population is an important factor in the current litigation as well. In 1981, and this is in the midst of that litigation, the population was 6,300. By the end of the decade, it had almost doubled. If you look at any state in the nation, it had very similar trajectories. Late in the 70s and early 80s and into the later on in the decade, that's when most states around the country and Congress enacted some fairly tough on crime sentencing policy, which resulted in pretty mammoth prison population growth. Then what happens in the 90s? The state of Alabama sees more accelerated growth in the prisons, okay? The same trajectory is seen in almost every state, but in Alabama, it was a little bit more accelerated. Then in Alabama, in the last decade, what you see for the first time is the first time Alabama's prison population ever really dropped, okay? In that first circle right there, it dropped because the state legislature passed a law that impaneled the second parole board, okay? What the state didn't do was they didn't do anything that impanel a second parole board. They didn't hire extra probation and parole officers. They didn't invest in any additional services, no additional mental health treatment, no additional substance abuse treatment. They invested nothing into the policy other than impaneling 3 people to hear additional parole hearings. That's why very quickly the population started to rebound after that second parole board was sunset. That's the most revocations Alabama has ever seen per capita at one time was after the second parole board. And very quickly you see less than 3 years after the onset of the second parole board, Alabama's prison population was higher than it was at the onset of that second board. 2005, 2006 was when we as a sentencing commission promulgated sentencing guidelines for really the first time in the state of Alabama, but the sentencing guidelines aren't what's really important today. But the prison population, those guidelines were voluntary, which means judges had the ability to use them, but they didn't have to use them, okay? And you can see the prison population kept increasing. And this 2011, that time period right here is when there was a case before the US Supreme Court involving the state of California, okay? At this time, Alabama's prisons were at 198% of capacity. We had a design capacity a little bit over 13,500. So we had roughly double the number of people in the prisons they were designed to. California was in federal court on two issues similar to ours. It was their ability to provide a constitutional level of medical care and a constitutional level of mental health care. What happened in California was the federal courts ruled all the way to the Supreme Court that overcrowding was the single issue to the state of California being able to provide constitutional levels of medical care. So the US Supreme Court ordered California to get their population down to 137.5% of capacity. Okay. And I also think it's very important for people to know it's kind of touch and go in the federal court some of the time. A lot of people ask me, how did the US Supreme Court arrive at 137.5% of capacity? What's the magic in that number? I'll tell you. Two different experts came in. One of them said, I think you can deliver a constitutional level of healthcare at 135%. Another expert testified he thought it was 140%. So the US Supreme Court split the difference. Okay, that's how we ended up with the 137.5% of capacity number. That forced California to reduce their prison population by about 50,000 individuals. And why it's really important for county officials in California, the state didn't say the prison had to release them. They just said they couldn't be in state facilities. So the US Supreme Court said you can build facilities, you can pay for them and build them, you can contract with private prisons, you can put them in county jails, or you can just release them. But the US Supreme Court didn't order them to release them. They just ordered to get their numbers down. So at the same time that happened, Alabama, okay, recognized the writing was on the wall. We're way more overcrowded than they were. The lawsuit in Alabama had just been filed on the same front. So Alabama enacted presumptive sentencing guidelines. Okay, so in 2013, you see what happened to Alabama's prison population from 2013 to 2018. And this is kind of the untold story that I think a lot of people in the state even do not know. This constitutes the nation's largest voluntary prison reduction in America's history. No other place in America has reduced their prison population more or by a higher percentage voluntarily than Alabama did from 2013 to 2018. Okay, I don't think anyone knew about this. Even as I traveled really throughout the state during this time, there was this perception that the state's prison population was just skyrocketing, when in fact it wasn't. It was decreasing at a very high clip. Well, that came to a screeching halt in 2018, and this was just in the news this past week as well. There was a tragedy in Marshall County by gentleman Jimmy Lee Spencer, tragically murdered those individuals in Marshall County. That's when Governor Ivey put in a moratorium on paroles, and the parole practices in Alabama changed drastically as well. And what's happened since 2018 is you see the prison population began to spike back up rather quickly. Okay, and then of course COVID hit. Okay, and the prison population dropped dramatically. Why did the prison population drop? One simple reason: no one went to prison. Okay, that's period, point blank, the end. People were not allowed into the prison, so that's why the prison population dropped. And you see, there's a pretty dramatic upward trajectory again. So to put it in perspective, the last 30 years, this is what Alabama's prison population looks like over the last 30 years. It's never been stable. Alabama's prison population has always been characterized traditionally by either accelerated growth or accelerated declines, period. And so that's what makes kind of Alabama policy so interesting, is there are many different factors that play into all of these decisions. It's not just the courts that factor in. It's law enforcement, it's DAs, it's defense lawyers, it's judges, it's parole board. It's the legislator's authority to promulgate new alternatives, brand new options, substance abuse, et cetera. So I'd put that up to say, we've never been stable. So when I hear people say, well, we just need to go back to the way we did it, we've never had a sustainable policy. I think that one of the things that if I really had a pet peeve, I guess, in kind of this line of work, is I think people fail to acknowledge the complexity. And then I think people also kind of pretend that there's always some sort of consensus about what the policy should be. Okay, it's always kind of the elephant in the room, and we're going to do a little exercise in a minute. I don't think any of us agree on anything really. And I'm going to do a very quick exercise to see why some of us might agree on one thing, but after that decision point, we probably agree on very little. And that's why the policies keep changing, is people's lack of consensus and agreement over a complicated system. Okay. So kind of contrary to that, the size of a prison population is only the factor of two different things, but both are nuanced and controversial. The only factors that influence the size of a prison population are the number of people that go to prison and how long do they stay. Those are the only two factors. Okay, but we fight like cats and dogs over both of them. Okay, people fight over who should go to prison, who can go to prison, and then people fight over how long people that go to prison actually serve. Those are both complicated issues, complicated questions. And I'd also remind you, there's 52 different ways that the United States does it. All 50 states have 50 different systems. Things are different crimes in all 50 states. That's under the purview of the different legislators, District of Columbia and Congress. Different states can categorize things as misdemeanors. They can categorize different things as felonies. They can say people can't go to jail or prison, but they have to in other places. All 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal system all do it different. Some things are felonies in some states, not in others, vice versa. Okay. So this is the current state of Alabama prison system, okay? And so in Alabama, we have 4 classifications of felonies. We have class A, B, C, and D. Class A's are the most serious offenses. Those are murder, rape, sodomy, drug trafficking, sexual torture. Those are pretty serious crimes, all the way down to class D. Class D crimes are unlawful possession of a controlled substance, possession of marijuana in the first degree, et cetera. Okay, so what you see is the bulk of the workload of the state courts in Alabama is dominated by class C and class D felony offenses, just in terms of percentage of total cases. But if you look to the right over there, you'll see the percentage of those individuals that currently constitute our prison system. So it makes sense, right? Someone that gets convicted of murder, they go to prison, they're going to sit there a long time. So even though there's not that many people convicted of serious offenses, those people constitute the overwhelming majority of people in prison. Okay, and this has changed drastically in the last 15 years. I'll just give you a quick example. My first day on the job here in 2005, I went to a sentencing docket, and this is pre-guidelines, and I won't name the county, but I saw 2 people get life sentences for unlawful possession of less than $10 worth of drugs. Right? I kind of knew I had my work cut out for myself if we're giving out life sentences for $10 worth of drugs. Okay. Alabama prisons used to have quite a few low-level offenders in prison. Okay. As you can see from the graph behind us, that's changed drastically. Are there some people? Sure. A lot of people still go to prison based on violations of their probation and parole, but very few, especially of the class D offenders, go to prison directly out of court. So over 5/6 of our prison population is constituted by class A and B felons. Okay. So I'm gonna kind of get to the meat of the argument. This is a quote from the United States Department of Justice report that was sent to Governor Ivey a few years ago. Okay. The department, referring to DOJ, has reasonable cause to believe that ADOC violates the constitutional rights of prisoners housed in Alabama prisons by failing to protect them from prisoner-on-prisoner violence, prisoner-on-prisoner sexual abuse, and by failing to provide safe conditions. Okay, those are pretty severe words coming from the Department of Justice. That's why we're in federal court right now. I'll just give, so when people say, you know, what really do you mean provide safe conditions? There was a facility that was open at the time of this report that was since closed. At the time the Department of Justice went in there, there was raw sewage flowing through the prison. Okay, there was an open trench that had raw sewage running through it, and that prison had been operating like that for years with raw sewage flowing through the kitchen. Okay, as a result of this report, that particular facility was closed. Okay, so I just want to talk for a minute about kind of the prison plan. I'm not an advocate for either side. I just want to give you some information to kind of help you chew on some of the big issues the state has to weigh. Typically, people weigh in and say they want to build all new prisons, or they think we don't need to build anything and we're going to be just fine. Right? People kind of failure to recognize the complexity in that. I just want to give you some money numbers. If the state didn't build any new prisons, okay, and we just simply renovated the ones we have right now, the unmet capital improvements for our 24 facilities is $850 million. That's how much it would cost to bring our existing 24 facilities up to code, $850 million. So even if you say you don't want to build any new prisons, it would take an investment of almost $1 billion to bring our existing facilities to code, which doesn't include any improvements. Okay, that doesn't include any additional programmatic space or space for anything. As Ryan said, is one of the things I think people are usually shocked when in fact they go into the Alabama prison system is other than areas where individuals are under psychotropic medication, there is no air conditioning. Okay, and it can get very, very hot. Obviously, you're looking at ambient temperatures in some of the housing units north of 100 degrees sometimes in the summer. And so when people have drug classes or some mental health classes, imagine if this room didn't have AC and there were 4 industrial fans positioned here in the corners blowing full steam, and we're at that table right there trying to communicate. It's very hard to hear. It's hard to hear, it's hard to learn. It's hard to learn, it's hard to change behavior. The prisons aren't really ideal spaces for programmatic space. Some of the 24 facilities have good space for programs, others don't, okay? So I just want to say, so if you don't build new prisons, 850 just to bring them up to code. If we build the new prisons that were authorized by the piece of legislation that the legislature passed and the governor signed, that was the authority that granted a bonding authority to float $1.2 billion worth of bonds, right? That doesn't replace all the existing prisons, however. That would replace 2 male facilities and 1 female facility. If those facilities were built out to their maximum capabilities, that replaces 1/2 of the existing bed space. So on top of the $1.2 billion that would be floated in the bonds, the state would still have to come up with enough money to renovate at least an additional 11,000 beds. And that's if we don't increase any capacity. Okay. So I was like to just mention that, to put that out there in the public space. I don't think people realize the money side of either side. If you don't do nothing, it'll cost us at least $1 billion. If we build, renovate, it'll probably upwards of $2 billion. This is an idea of, this is a facility in Elmore County. Very, very few of the prisons in Alabama have what most people would consider as prisons with single cells. The majority of Alabama prisons are open bay housing units. The actual really picture that you see here represents 1/2 of the living space at a facility in Elmore County. Okay. So I'm briefly going to go, I'm going to mention 2 other subjects and then open it up for really question. The biggest thing that DOC faces, and it runs through all the federal litigation, is their ability to staff the prisons. One thing from traveling the state for the last 15 years to speaking in Rotary clubs or civic clubs like this in all 67 counties is people generally want prison to be a tough experience. Right? That's a sentiment that I get a lot around the state, is they want it tough. Okay. I don't think people think about the Department of Corrections is the state's largest law enforcement agency. They don't think about that. The correctional officers go through law enforcement training, they're APOS certified. They represent the state's largest law enforcement group. So the same conditions you impose on the inmates, you also impose on the people that you ask to work in the facilities. Okay. And I always tell people, how many of you want to sign up for a starting wage of $32,000 to work the night shift, mandatory overtime in non-air conditioned facilities, and have no say-so over where you work in the state? Not a lot of takers. That's why we struggle staffing our prisons. The legislature has increased the amount of money that we pay, but there's still other really large issues that factor into recruiting and retaining individuals. Our attrition rate for correctional officers within 3 years is almost 80%. Okay. Imagine operating a business where the attrition rate of your new employees is 80% within 3 years. So we're constantly in a game of recruiting, training, recruiting, training, recruiting, training, recruiting, training. We spend an enormous amount of money recruiting, training. And people always ask me, where do they go? They go to your local sheriff's offices. They go to your local police forces. Why? They pay more money. They're not inside a facility and they're safer. That's who poaches the Department of Corrections employees, are your local police forces. All their training has already been paid for. They can pluck them out. They're already APO certified. They are looking to get out of the facilities. So that's typically who plucks off our COs, is local law enforcement entities and sheriff's offices. We're ordered as a state to hire by a federal judge 2,000 additional correctional officers. Our current staffing level is 40% of what we're supposed to have. Let that sink in. We're at 40% of what we're supposed to have for correctional officers. A federal judge has ordered us to hire an extra 2,000 officers. Still not very many applications coming in that door. There's not a lot of people signing up to work in these facilities, and when they get there, they're generally on the first thing out the minute they get an opportunity. I want to talk about just an example about why I say that I think a lot of people kind of give a false sense that we're knocking on the door of we have an answer policy-wise. Okay. I think majority of the conversation that dominates a lot of the news I see is typically on the fringes. Talk a lot about death penalty. We talk a lot about possession of marijuana. Okay. Not a lot of people in prison for both. Those are both serious, weighty issues that really deserve a lot of attention. But when we talk about the demands of the prison system, what drives the money in the prison system, it's not capital punishment and it's not possession of marijuana offenders. Okay. I'll just give you an idea. There are 166 people on death row. There's 97 people in prison for possession of marijuana. So out of 22,000, that group right there is 230 combined. Okay. The other people are generally where we don't agree on. Okay. And I'll just go through an example or two just to show you. I would, let's say on the way out of Birmingham, I stopped by a convenience store and I get the great idea to pull out a gun and go put it in the clerk's face. And I tell the clerk, you give me all that money or I'm going to kill you. Okay. First question, should I go to prison? Majority of people have the same answer on that one. Okay. Most people agree you go waving guns in people's faces, threatening to kill them. Most of us agree on that. Okay. That's where the agreement stops. Okay. Based on that scenario, what sentence should I get? Okay. Once you don't blurt anything out, I want you just to keep that in your head. Okay. Then let me say this. Would it matter that I had a mental health issue? Would in fact it matter to you that I was paranoid schizophrenic and I wasn't on my meds when I did it? Should that factor in? Would it matter that I'm in my 40s and I've never done anything before? Or would it matter to you that I'm in my 20s and I have 3 other felony convictions? Should that matter? And if it matters, how much should it matter? How much of the weight of the sentence should go towards the current conduct? How much of the weight of the sentence should go to my past conduct? How about, is in fact there anything that would it matter to you that I was honorably discharged from the military? Should that matter? Should it matter to you that I was a youth mentor in the community? I was a youth football coach. I was an upstanding person. I just happened to do that wrong. Okay. This is when the wheels come off the tracks. Some people say, I don't care about any of that. I want the punishment to match what Bennet did. I don't care what he did in the past or anything. I just want that. Okay. So we already run into difficulties there about what should determine the sentence. Is it just the conduct? Is it past conduct? Is it behavior of the individual? Okay. Then the one where we really don't agree on is based on that sentence. How long should Bennet serve of that sentence? Okay. Let's say Bennet got a 30-year sentence for that. I did that here. I pulled out the gun, threatened. I actually threatened the clerk at the convenience store. The judge handed down a 30-year sentence. How long of that 30 years should I serve? Okay. Some people say every single day of it. Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Should I be rewarded for my conduct once I enter prison? Should that be a factor in determining how long I stay? If I'm a model inmate, if I get letters from the warden, all the COs, other inmates that said, Bennet was the best thing ever. Bennet came in and helped us do all these programs. He helped people in hospice. He did that. He completed drug treatment. He's now one of our inmate counselors for mental health care, for substance abuse. Should that matter? And I can tell you from doing these exercises with large groups of people, people don't agree. We are all over the spectrum on that. And when he makes it more complicated, people say, well, yeah, that should matter a little bit. Other people say, no, that should matter a lot. It's a lot. To further complicate that, I want you to think about you being a CO in a facility. Okay. You talk to any correctional officer that's ever worked in a prison. Guess what the best two things are for inmate management? TVs, right? You take away TVs, all you know what's about to break loose. Okay. Guess what the second thing is? Hope, the ability to be released based on your conduct. If you go in as an 18-year-old kid and you know you're going to serve 30 years, is there any incentive to do what you're supposed to do? None. There's no incentive. I'm going to sit there 30 years. I'm going to make this tough on you as it is on me. But if there's a chance based on what I do to help myself and to help others, I'd have a hope of possibly doing it. Sure. Okay. Now, we can go through all the different scenarios. There are obviously lines of demarcation in there between serious sex offenders, murderers, robbers, drug dealers, a variety of things. But the question is, how do we frame policy to determine who goes, what sentences they get, and how long do they stay? Those are all very weighty subjects, and they're very difficult to write policies that aren't too strict, but also allow for wiggle room, but also don't allow for too much wiggle room to allow for unwarranted disparity. Okay. It's a pretty tall task, and that's one of the reasons why you see Alabama's prison population has fluctuated over the time. The policies change, kind of like a pendulum. The policies always change, or the people in the positions that have the same authority, their individual practices change. We're typically in a state where policies change drastically, or people that make that are in charge of implementing the policies and practices change greatly as really well. I see we're at the 12:45 mark. I'll leave it open for any questions. Does anyone have